Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation. And viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, we begin our look at what the Biden climate plan means for New Mexico.
We need to get off of oil and gas revenue, and we need to do that now, and the way to do that is changing the tax system.
Plus, the First Lady of the Navajo Nation talks about missing and murdered Indigenous women. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. COVID continues to circumscribe the boundaries of life in 2021. At the Roundhouse, a positive case among House Republicans riled an already rancorous environment. And vaccine shortages have reined in ambitious plans to reopen schools in some parts of the state. The Line will get at both of those issues, as well as a grim outlook for irrigation season in the Rio Grande. We have a trio of great interviews this week in addition to the Biden climate plan and missing and murdered Indigenous women. We'll also focus on the ethics of delivering vaccine in a state like New Mexico. We start with The Line and cautious steps towards going back to school. There's hardly anyone who is arguing kids learn better online, and so New Mexico is anxious to get students back into the classroom. Our new president promised within 100 days, and the governor wants to let students return as early as this coming Monday. Can it be done? And more importantly, can it be done safely? Here to parse that issue is our Line Opinion panel. We welcome back attorney and public safety analyst Ed Perea. Good to see you again, Ed. And Line regulars Tom Garrity and Sophie Martin join us this week as well. Ed, starting with you, Albuquerque Public Schools met this week, decided to kick the can down the road for another 2 weeks while trying to convince the state that to still allow their athletes to compete while virtual learning goes on a little longer. Here's my question. The governor has given the go-ahead to school districts, but do they have the data they need to make this decision?
Gee, there's a lot of data out there, and you're hearing both sides of the story. And depending on who you're talking to, there's the group that really wants to get these schools opened up. And for those schools, or those individuals, or those groups, parents and otherwise, who are really supporting opening up the schools to some degree, I think they review the data as positive on their behalf. Some of the numbers that have come out is of 1,100 or so tests that have been given, probably 0.04% actually came back positive. So they're saying of the number of people that have tested with an APS, they're just not seeing the problem there. And also nationally, we are seeing from the experts are saying maybe it's not that big of a issue, of a problem when it comes to the spread of this virus, to reopen some of the schools to some degree. So that's the argument on one side. The argument on the other side clearly are the teachers are saying, well, hold on here. When we bring students in together, even with safety practices, we're still at risk. Our families are at risk. We come to campus and we go home and we may expose others to the virus. Right. So there's the concern of both sides. I guess the short of it is, where you stand depends on which side of the table that you're sitting on. And so, and I think that's where we're at now with the APS argument that's taking place.
I like the way you put that. I really like the way you put that. Sophie, obviously when I say, I'm not trying to be cute here, vaccinations is obviously, the word of the day here for teachers. Should all teachers be moved to the front of the line to have some comfort for parents and everybody else?
I think there's some important balance that needs to be struck there. It makes me think of, actually, there's an interesting piece in the New Mexican about what Santa Fe Prep, which admittedly probably has more resources than our public schools, what Santa Fe Prep has done. And they've been able to put in place a system that seems pretty rational. But part of what's going on there is that their teachers have been vaccinated. They were able to get their teachers vaccinated in advance of reopening. And that, I think makes a huge difference. There is something I do want to point out, though, that Education Weekly has had a series running just earlier this week. I was going to say earlier this month, but it's still the beginning of the month. And one of the things that's come out is that not every child does poorly with remote learning, that a number of children actually do better and have said, my grades are improving, my focus has improved, I'm not wasting time in the way that I might have at school. That seems like a very motivated child. I might have been good at that too. Certainly that's not true for everyone. But one of the things I have to give New Mexico credit for is that, unlike what I hear of some other states, it wasn't governor, executive mandating you will open.
Right.
It is, all right, schools, you have an opportunity, put your plans together. Mm-hmm. And some school systems in New Mexico, I think, is it Las Vegas, I think, is saying, yeah, not for the rest of the school year. Let's just put it out there. We're not going to open now. Different schools are looking at different plans, and it's not just sort of wave a wand and we're open. Mm-hmm. There's a lot that has to happen before a particular district can open. Going back to vaccines, it seems to me that obviously that would make a big difference in terms of the comfort level and the safety of the educators,
right.
And not just the educators, but the bus drivers, mm-hmm. the janitors, everyone who works in that system. I think we forget sometimes, and I think it's important to remind ourselves, we are talking about teachers, but they are also talking about everyone else who goes into work to make the schools happen.
Good points there. Hey, Tom, interestingly, when I read this journal article, some of the criteria, counties that are red, like APS, just mentioned, 25% of in-person staff will have to be tested weekly. Schools in yellow and green counties, which currently is just Harding and Union County right now, 12.5 of its staff is going to have to be tested each week. But the problem is they're having trouble getting to 10% on the testing at this point. Can we really ramp up where we need to be ready to go with this in a couple of weeks?
Well, I think in some areas you can, but in large part, what we saw, I think, with the governor's declaration in the state of the state was that she opened up the bridge to nowhere. Mm-hmm. As far as saying, okay, great, let's go ahead and open up schools, and really kind of shifted the responsibility to the schools who were going, oh, hey, how are we going to hit testing? How does red, yellow, green kind of impact us? Right. And by the way, where do we find 1,200 school bus drivers? as far as in the Albuquerque public schools. So I think that there are a lot of items that school districts were surprised with, because they thought they were going to have additional time with respect to getting ramped up and back up and running. They had some time, but that runway was basically taken away with that February 8th opportunity. It wasn't a mandate. It was just an opportunity for schools. And what it's really going to test, though, is the ability for school districts to communicate not just with their teachers, but also with the parents in the community, because there's all of a sudden an expectation that, the normal of remote learning is about to change.
Right.
And school districts, big or small, need to be able to manage that narrative right now, or they'll have the mob rule kind of take over and set the narrative for them.
That's right. Boy, I tell you what, you just really hit a home run there. I agree 100%. Hey, Sophie, we are top 3 in the country for testing right now. Yay, New Mexico. Does that make a difference? I mean, we're doing okay compared to most.
Listen, we're doing okay on testing. We're also doing really, I think, well, more than okay on testing. I think we're doing well on vaccination rates. This state has been, out front in most areas since the start of the pandemic. But being number 3, being up there, doesn't necessarily mean that we have all that we need. Why is testing important? It helps to give us a sense of what percentage of the population is effective. Epidemiologists can extrapolate from that, from the smaller sample size, to how many people might actually have it, what the spread is in the state. Mm-hmm. When we look at the educational system, testing is essential in other ways. I mean, there's a requirement for schools that open, and that if 4 kids in your classroom, 4 kids at your school. Now I'm going to admit that I can't remember which one it is, but
I bet it's school.
Is the threshold at which point everyone goes home. And if there's not testing, you don't know necessarily that you've met that threshold.
Yep.
And that leaves everyone at that school less safe.
Mm-hmm. Good point there. Hey, Ed, we've got just about a minute here. I want you to pick up on that as well. President Biden's pledge. Does that make a difference, or is that just, inauguration day talk?
And that pledge for what, Gene?
Have everyone 100 days, have everybody back in school in the first 100 days.
Well, I guess, Gene, we really, again, we don't want to move too quickly, but we want to move steadily. I think, again, there's still a lot of concerns out here with regard to the last question as far as where we rank on testing. Just look back to a month to 2 months ago when we were spiking, when we had a very serious problem. So I think the testing is important. The testing provides us some data which to make some of the decisions that need to be made. But we don't want to move too quickly. I know there's this push to it, but I'm from the camp that we don't want to jump too far ahead. We want to move when we're ready. I like a pledge. I think a pledge isn't a promise, but it sets a goal for us. I think the pledge is fine. Let's move in that direction. Let's continue to follow the data and let's see where we're at.
There you go. Have to wrap that up there. This group is back in a few minutes to talk about COVID at the Roundhouse and the long contentious road ahead for lawmakers.
Diversifying the economy is something that has off and on been a strategy in New Mexico for a long, long time. It hasn't occurred to the extent that a lot of people would like.
New Mexico's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Relatives Task Force recently released a report outlining its findings and recommendations to the governor and legislature. Governor Lujan Grisham created the task force in 2019 to chart a path to addressing the crisis. The group's 64-page report shows a need for data collection, resources, improved reporting of cases, and a number of areas of need, including support for families. Violence against women and human trafficking continue to be contributing factors to missing and murdered Indigenous people cases in the state. New Mexico's 19 Pueblos, Apache tribes, and the Navajo Nation are working on ways to address the issue. Correspondent Antonia Gonzalez talks with the First Lady of the Navajo Nation about her work on the task force and what members need from the legislature this session.
Joining us now is the First Lady of the Navajo Nation. Thank you so much for joining us here on New Mexico in Focus. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Pavilion S. I'm the First Lady of the Navajo Nation. That's how I relate to my Navajo relatives.
All right, thank you so much. And I wanted to share or have you share a little bit about the very important serious work of missing and murdered Indigenous people. It is a really tough topic for the Navajo Nation, families, and Indigenous people across the United States to talk about, but it's also a very important issue. Can you share some of your work you're doing on task forces both in New Mexico and in Arizona?
Well, for New Mexico, I've been working with the task force, was appointed October of last year, and we just ended our task force duties for the first year in November of 2020. So it went 2019 to 2020. And for the Navajo Nation, from the Office of the First Lady and Second Lady, a lot of our efforts have been revolving around just educating the public on MMIW, and then as well as human trafficking, because there's a connection there definitely, but it's not one and the same. And then for the Arizona human, and the other one that we've been reaching out to is the Arizona Governor's Human Trafficking and Human Trafficking Advisory Council, and then New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force. So it's been a lot of efforts of partnering with them to educate the public on some of these items.
And the task force here in New Mexico recently released a report of the work and recommendations for the governor and also New Mexico state lawmakers. What is the top priority that the task force found that needs to be done to address missing and murdered Indigenous people in New Mexico?
It would be data collection. There's you're talking about numerous tribes and pueblos in New Mexico, and every one of those tribes and pueblos, we have our own tribal justice systems. Everybody has their own laws, and so as sovereign nations, it's really something that needs to be addressed almost internally. But then, of course, we want to keep support of the state of New Mexico. So it would be a partnership across jurisdictions and also with the federal institutions as well.
And how does law enforcement looking at jurisdictions play? Because there are a number of tribes in New Mexico, the Navajo Nation, Apache tribes, and the Pueblo communities, all sovereign nations, like you said, with different laws, language, culture, history, and then working not only just locally on the state and national level. So how is working with law enforcement, why is that key in addressing this issue?
You know, a lot of it starts with reporting. And the second step in that is the actual classifications. And so when you're looking at different databases, they don't all collect the same types of information. And the other important factor here is accessibility. Who gets access to these data collection centers and how are they utilized? That's really been the top two findings, I think, from the report itself. So when we're talking about collaborations and partnering, we can't force another jurisdiction or, across even from border towns, like for Navajo Nation, we wouldn't be able to strong any border town or any county or any state court system or PD to give us information. So it really has to be done in a collaborative effort. And I think that's always been the greatest barrier, maybe.
And part of the task force, not only looking at these issues, is a lack of resources. What kind of resources are needed to look, study, create a database, and just keep this movement of MMIW and other missing persons going?
In terms of database, I think for the tribes ourselves, it's because so for example, some of our tribal members, they have memberships or they're either married or have children in other tribal communities. So when you have two tribal communities who don't share the same database, it's really hard to even connect in those ways. So maybe that's where that those shared agreements to have access to each other's reporting databases, that's very important. But the other one that we see firsthand, I guess, on tribal communities is just a reluctance to even report certain things to law enforcement. And then beyond that would just be, there's a great need for education, I think, of the public on how the criminal justice system operates on each tribal system. And then, of course, you have to look at how things operate off the nation. If things occur, if there's an incident that occurs off the nation, you're looking at either working with a city, a county, or state a justice system. And then, of course, when the federal justice system gets involved, that's a whole different layer of items so every case is not always going to be the same. And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion that sets in place, and it's where a lot of distrust happens. But there needs to be definitely a great amount of education to the public on that.
And what is the importance of having families involved in the process? What kind of things are you hearing from families? And we're not just talking about, just older women. The Navajo Nation very unfortunately lost Ashlyn Mike, which was, internationally known, and the community came together to remember her. And it was such a hard time on not only the Navajo Nation, but other tribes across the country relating to these different types of cases. So what are you hearing from families?
For families, it's just a lot of support services, wraparound services, comprehensive services. That's really what's needed during the time when an incident occurs. And then there's also need for services for returning survivors. So families do need support when a member of their family returns home, and that's usually sometimes that's left out of the conversations, but we definitely heard from some families who are struggling with that right now.
And can you share some information about some of the work the Navajo Nation in particular is doing on missing and murdered Indigenous people?
There's definitely a lot of education and prevention efforts. You see a lot more on that end. In the future, we would like to see more in terms of, reporting. But of course, in order for anybody to report anything, they need to know what it is that they're looking for and how some of these things occur. And I think that's something. Maybe that's the reason why we don't have many people reporting, because they don't know what it is that they're really seeing and witnessing happening in their own communities.
And is there any resource that people should reach out to or look to if they're in need of assistance?
We'll be posting resource links on our new website for the Office of the First Lady, Second Lady. So that's where a lot of families will be, will definitely be making that known during the virtual event. We'll have a website and then a forthcoming app, so they'll always have access to those on there.
Well, First Lady, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this very important and hard issue that many families and tribes across the country, including the Navajo Nation, are working on.
Thank you.
It's been a strange week at the Roundhouse in Santa Fe. Just before last week's episode aired, we learned a member of House Republican caucus tested positive for COVID-19. The group of 25 conservative lawmakers has been the most critical of both the governor's response to the pandemic and now the largely online nature of the session itself. That didn't sit well with Democratic Speaker of the House, Brian Egolf, who accused House Republicans of being reckless with regard to public health. They sued. We're still waiting for a Supreme Court opinion on the House rules, possibly next week. And here we are, not even halfway through the session. And Sophie, perhaps the most surprising thing about the sessions this week, they've been relatively civil. You know, Mr. Egolf eased up on his 3 in the people chamber rule, and about half the Republicans showed up in person. What do you make of this whole dust up? Is this just like, you can't tell us what to do, so we're just going to do what's not right? How do you make what's going on here?
Some of this is posturing. Some of it is sort of virtue signaling on both sides.
Right. Fair enough.
But what neither party really has control over, let's face it, is the pandemic itself. And just like we've seen for all of us for the last basically year, dealing with the pandemic, adding the pandemic on top of everything you already have to do, in this case in a 60-day session, it was just bound to add extra conflict, extra opportunities for chest pounding, etc. I think frankly, message to legislators, I think that for the general public, the New Mexico electorate, we want to see action. We want to see work happening, and this kind of squabbling is more than unfortunate. It is a distraction from the work that really needs to get done. And I will say that work is getting done. I mean, we've seen some important bills filed right off the bat, a number of bills that Democrats have been trying to get past the governor's desk, let's put it that way, that they couldn't get past Governor Martinez, that Governor Lujan Grisham has indicated she will sign. And so I think we're going to see some real progress on some of those bills early on. We're already seeing progress, but the big work, the state's COVID response, et cetera, that's, I think, going to be a big focus of what the electorate wants to see happen. And that's got to get rolling.
That's a good point there. Hey, Ed, interestingly, we're just under 2,000 coronavirus tests conducted at the Roundhouse, and they began on-site testing on January 15th. And as we know now, the reporting, they've had just 5 positive test results, or 0.4%. Does that make a difference to you? I mean, does that say to you that Republicans are in fact taking care? Because if they weren't, we'd have a whole lot more cases than this. And I'll remind folks, our average statewide is 7% versus the 0.4% we're seeing up in the Roundhouse.
Gene, this is a new environment, and it's It's not part of the general population, but it could be the starting point. If we're not careful, if we recall back to the beginning of this virus back in March, April, May, June, locally, not many people knew anyone who had contracted the virus. But as time went on, more and more people knew more and more people who had the virus. So it started from somewhere. So we want to be careful and not to get too comfortable with the fact that only so many people, so many tests, only so many people, that 0.04% that you mentioned has come back positive. We want to take advantage of that and look at that in a positive way, but not to take it for granted and loosen up on the precautions that we all need to take. My concern would be that we take some comfort that the positivity rate is low, and then we move in the opposite direction by not taking the necessary steps that's going to keep that number as low as the initial results.
If I could jump in though,
Please.
Legislators are not required to be tested. And if we're not testing, we're not really able to get accurate measurements. And the Republican legislators in particular have pushed back against the testing program. And so when we say 0.04, two things. One is this is for, by and large, a white collar group that, not exclusively, but in general, legislators and their staff would be expected to reflect the transmission rates that of people who are able to protect themselves, stay home, et cetera, as opposed to our frontline workers who are really at greater risk. We see people of color at greater risk for underrepresented communities at greater risk for COVID infection. But I have to point out, this is not a comprehensive plan. Legislators can choose to opt out of being tested. And as we know, many people are asymptomatic. So I'm not sure that figure really means that much.
I appreciate that. That's why they call that contact, Jay. Go ahead, Ed. Sorry
just
about
very
that.
quick, Sophie G, just very quickly. Yeah, and when you look at the data, the number of people that one person who tests positive can affect are just enormous and exponential. And so, caution, caution, caution. Don't take comfort in the low numbers at this point.
And I think you guys are describing quite well where Brian Egolf is coming from. there's no end of frustration for this man, and sometimes some of the comments he's made about this sort of get at that. But Tom, let me ask you this. This is also interesting. It came out last week that during the first 3 days of the session, there was a positive case there, and nobody knew it. And given the restrictions for who can be in the Capitol, should a positive test have been announced right away?
Well, in this age, transparency is really key. So, I think that the more transparency that's out there, the better. So yes is the short answer to that. Longer answer is that I think that what we've seen at the Roundhouse has been so far a responsible approach. Now, I'm not saying that the Democrats are right and the Republicans are wrong. I think the Republicans have a lot of great points that they raised before the Supreme Court. They just didn't raise them the best way possible. And of those points, as far as going remote, does that really provide residents in the rural part of the state who tend to be more right-leaning than left have true access to participate in all of the proceedings? And then the second is as far as just going back to Santa Fe, is what happened to the Santa Fe Convention Center? I thought they were supposed to open up the convention center to make everything a lot more accessible. So I think that there is a lot of confusion out there right now. I think everybody's kind of taking that chill pill and is kind of saying, okay, great, we've all made our points. Now maybe we can focus on legislation. But my hope is that perhaps that there will be just a little bit more consistency in the rulemaking between the House and the Senate. Because I think that having the consistent rules, as far as the rules that bind the Senate are the same rules that bind the House, will help to kind of calm the overall kind of sense of anxiety that tends to make the headlines.
Ed, you just got a little bit under a minute here. Just a quick question about the Supreme Court you mentioned earlier. What's your sense of their chances? Honestly, this idea that it's unconstitutional to not physically be in Santa Fe, is that a winner?
It really looks like the courts recently, in a number of different cases, and I'm sure the court will follow here, is that this pandemic has created a unique situation where all members of society, all walks of life, have to make those adjustments in the interest of public safety and public health. So I think if the issue is about public health and the health of those participants in the legislature, both the legislators and staff, that the court will likely uphold any issue relating to adjustments in the interest of public safety.
Mm-hmm. Got you there. Have to hold our conversation there, but in a similar vein, and most especially with a shortage, figuring out who gets a shot and who needs to wait is critical. Doing that job equitably can be especially challenging. New Mexico has already made some embarrassing gaffes as it rolled out its vaccine registration system, as you might have read. Family members and friends of medical workers jumped the line early on, and it's still an open question as to how thoroughly claims of comorbidities, sorry, you know the word I'm trying to say, are being checked. Recently, Megan Kamerick sat down virtually with Gallaudet University philosophy professor and bioethicist Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke to work through some of those tough questions.
Teresa, there are concerns the distribution of the COVID vaccine may not be as equitable and efficacious as bioethicists would have hoped. As you see it, is the vaccine being distributed ethically and equally? Are there any groups you wish had priority over others?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think that the priorities that the CDC has put together are ethical priorities. The devil is in the details. So one question is, of course, we all want to reduce death and serious disease. The other one is we want society to keep functioning. But the big concern for many people is how do we reduce the burden that COVID has on populations that are already being more stressed by COVID. And so one thought is, how do we identify these populations? These are often people who are of lower socioeconomic status, they're poor, they may live in multi-generational housing, they may not have access to food and other things. So these communities also often don't have the healthcare infrastructure that we need. So where are the vaccine sites? How do we get this information out to these populations? And are they accessible? These are big priorities for New Mexico.
Let's say you had full control of who got the vaccine and when. How would you make the vaccination effort fairer for all?
That's such a good question. Well, I think that it's, of course, not just up to me. And even if I were told I could make the decision myself, I would ask and include members of the populations who feel that they have been disregarded. But one thing I think is important to do is to consider where are these sites located, but maybe even before that, what's the infrastructure? Do we have enough of the vaccines in particular areas, especially communities that have been hit hard? Vaccine locations that are easily accessible to people, not just in terms of are they on a bus line, do people have cars so they can get there, but also what about people with disabilities? Is there signage for deaf people who may not be able to speech read because people are wearing masks? Do we have entrances and exits with ramps rather than stairs? And this is actually a problem with one of the sites. I was just notified of this yesterday. Do we have information that's accessible to people before they get on site, so that they know what to expect and what to anticipate? So these are some of the things that are important to people with disabilities that haven't really been considered, not just here in New Mexico. I think New Mexico is doing a pretty good job, but nationally.
And we take it you have a copy of President Biden's national COVID response. Is there anything promising in the plan? Anything surprising?
Well, I'm excited about it. It does take specific note of people who are what we call under the social vulnerability index category. I mean, everyone can be assigned certain kinds of vulnerabilities depending on where they live, what kind of resources they have access to, and so forth. And the Biden plan has a particular effort to make sure that these populations that are often overlooked are not being overlooked. There's a lot of attention being given to those communities. And as a bioethicist, one of the things I look at are values, and how are the values of the American people represented in such a document? How do these get manifested in the choices and the priorities, and whose lives and well-being are prioritized when there's so many competing interests, whether it's economics and education, and of course, health and well-being.
Do you feel like the document represents that?
So it's 200 pages long plus, and I read through it very quickly a few nights ago. I didn't see any flags, so I'm encouraged and hopeful. I will later this week be going through it with a fine-tooth comb and then making recommendations to various people about my thoughts on this. And in particular, since I do a lot of work with disability communities, we'll look for how this supports and provides acknowledgement of the needs of people with disabilities.
Let's compare what's happening in New Mexico versus other states. Is there anything we should be modeling or anything we should be avoiding?
Well, actually, I think New Mexico's doing a really good job. I'm most familiar with what's happening in DC and Maryland and Virginia, because that is another place where I spend a lot of time and I'm familiar with that community. One thing that New Mexico has done differently than a lot of states is in the most recent vaccine allocation plan, which is dated January 22nd, New Mexico actually makes specific reference to verification of employment and of qualifying conditions. And I asked around, because I was told this might be a topic that would come up, and I asked colleagues around the country and got some input also from international bioethicist colleagues. And what they've said is this is very much an honor system in most locations. Now, whether that will change remains to be seen, because these vaccine allocation plans are shifting as we learn more about what works and what doesn't work. But I was very pleased to see that in New Mexico, there is going to be verification of employment, and then also that people with qualifying conditions should be prepared to verify medically what their conditions are. And of course, this is tricky because it gets into issues of medical privacy. So we have to be careful about that.
There have been reports of people line jumping the vaccination process. They're sharing event codes meant for healthcare workers on the registration portal. And coupled with that, the system does rely on people to be truthful. Do you think these safeguards, I guess we'll find out, but you think that we have them here, but that's not necessarily universal right now around the country?
Not at this point. So again, I asked a number of colleagues about this in states in the Northeast, Southeast, West Coast, and Midwest. And everything that I received said, so far it's honor system. Now, line jumping, I think no matter what the context is, we'll always have a few people who do that. It's part of the free rider problem, if you will. But I think that we have to wait and see. Is this a problem that is a systemic issue? If so, then we really should fix it. Is it a once in a while thing? If it's a once in a while thing, is this the best way for us to allocate our very limited resources in public health? So it's partly, I think, a matter of how do we distribute the resources we have in the most effective ways. And that may not be the best use of our resources at this point in time.
Because verifying also takes resources and time. And
and it takes it away from the work that our public health, Department of Health workers and those who are in supportive contexts are doing.
So the New Mexico Department of Health is aiming to vaccinate people with at least one chronic condition in this phase. That includes conditions that could be hard to verify, like smoking or your BMI, your body mass index. Should we be putting people who say smoke as one of those conditions ahead of someone who has a serious crippling neurologic disorder? Okay, so I am not a medical doctor.
I'm a bioethicist, so I'm not going to be able to make judgments about which medical conditions are more risky. The CDC has done that, and ACIP, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices in the CDC, has looked at these conditions. And my understanding is that this list is shifting as we get more scientific information. Again, that's a question for the scientists. But the question you just asked me is, when you have conditions that are hard to verify, how much weight should we be giving people in terms of their self-report? Mm-hmm. And I think, again, this is going to be, it's tricky. I think it's a matter of balancing the resources that we have. What's the best use of our resources? Do we have the capacity to do this? And again, if we find that it's a systemic problem where somehow we're learning about many people who are doing this, then we'd have to add other safeguards. I actually don't know, because I couldn't find my previous draft copy of the vaccine allocation plan, but it might be worth exploring to see if there was verification language that was different on earlier drafts of this particular plan. And I did not see anything about verification in the most recent CDC website about vaccines. Doesn't mean it isn't there, but I looked for it and I couldn't find it. So perhaps this will be an issue that comes up later.
As they respond to imperfections in the system,
yes.
Which happens in a lot of systemic rollouts. Well, Teresa, thank you so much for talking with us about this.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Climate change is an important issue for New Mexico, but so is the economic impact of the oil and gas industry. In the coming weeks, we're looking at how President Joe Biden's executive order on climate change might affect the state. Correspondent Laura Paskus spoke with New Mexico State University economist Jim Peach about the pause on new oil and gas leases on some federal lands and the state's need to diversify away from fossil fuels.
Welcome, Jim Peach. Last week, President Joe Biden signed an executive order regarding climate change, and we'll be looking at many different aspects of the different provisions in this order. But today, we're talking about the pause on new oil and gas leases on some federal lands. Will this affect New Mexico's economy in the short term, in the long term? What do you think?
It's a complicated answer, but I'll be quick about it. The portion of the executive order that everybody's concerned about is Section 208, that the moratorium on new leases on federal land. There was a previous order from the Secretary of the Interior, the acting secretary, and we can talk about that later. This particular order does not address permits. It does not restrict permits. 97% of the federal land that's worth leasing has already been leased. And so this particular order won't have much of an effect. We can talk about the previous order from the Secretary of the Interior, which put a 60-day moratorium on new permits. And that is something a little bit different. I would assume that the presidential order overrides the Secretary of the Interior's order, but there may be clarification on that. And so I don't think it's going to have a huge impact in the short run. In the long run, 4 or 5 years from now, we don't know, because we don't know what else is coming down the road here.
These are interesting times, to say the least. We've got a global pandemic, climate change, political change, economic challenges. Can New Mexico also handle trying to diversify its economy right now and move away from oil and gas dependence maybe? And if so, why should the state be thinking about doing that?
Well, the state depends for 35 or 40% of its total revenue on oil and gas. And that's just a terrible kind of situation to be in, because oil and gas prices bounce around a lot, and they have. The legislature and executive branch people in Santa Fe have known this was a problem for about 4 decades and have not done much about it. Diversifying the economy is something that has off and on been a strategy in New Mexico for a long, long time. It hasn't occurred to the extent that a lot of people would like. We're not going to diversify in the short run. We need to get off of oil and gas revenue, and we need to do that now. And the way to do that is changing the tax system.
I feel like whenever these conversations start happening about whether it's regulation on the oil and gas industry or these federal pauses, there's a lot of talk about the obstacles for the oil and gas industry or obstacles for the state in diversifying the economy. I'm curious, though, if you see opportunities in all of this happening.
The opportunities would be to work closely with the Biden administration to guide future regulations on this. The Delaware Basin, that portion of the Permian that's in New Mexico, is the hottest shale play in the world. And the oil companies are not going to abandon that. It's a very complicated process. We've got state land, private land, and federal land all mixed up together. Some people call it a checkerboard. I'd call it a plate of spaghetti. It's a real mess. And so the oil companies do face significant problems in getting permits, not just to drill, but for pipelines and the like. New Mexico has done pretty well on this. New Mexico oil production has just skyrocketed over the last 10 or 12 years. In 2008, New Mexico produced 62 million barrels of oil, about half of its previous peak. Last year, in 2019, we produced 330 million barrels. The final figures for 2020 are not in yet, but we will have exceeded that a little bit in 2020. The question is, for opportunities, there's still lots of oil in the ground there. And even from an environmental perspective, you can't shift from fossil fuels to wind and solar instantly. A lot of that oil is going to come out of the ground. And so there's still plenty of opportunity in New Mexico for that. The state land office is doing their best on state lands to try to diversify the mix of revenues. They're signing leases on wind and solar and the like. But it's a hard kind of thing.
So 20 or 30 or 50 years out, given climate change, changes in sort of consumer habits, all of these different things, will the oil and gas industry still be a robust industry, an industry that will boost the state's economy?
My best guess is that a generation from now, it'll be a much smaller portion of the New Mexico economy. It'll be a much smaller portion of the energy mix. The electric vehicle is coming. Some people would say it's here. I think it's going to be 5 or 10 years before there are enough EVs on the road to make a dent in gasoline demand. And certainly for a long time, we're going to have a demand for jet fuel. It's just hard to make a solar-powered airplane. And I know people are experimenting, especially in Europe. Airbus is experimenting with possibly hydrogen cells for airplanes, and a lot of things could happen. But oil is going to be around for a while. My guess is that either now or fairly soon, we really will have reached the peak demand for oil.
All right. Well, Jim Peach, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome anytime, Laura.
This is a La Nina year, and recent storms notwithstanding, that's usually not a good situation for New Mexico. Snowpack is likely to be down, meaning less water flowing this spring into reservoirs and fields. That's on top of an average snow season last year, when the Rio Grande dried for long stretches during the summer and even into the fall. Our Laura Paskus has been covering it, as you know, along with other journalists around the state. Already, Laura's reporting that irrigators below Elephant Butte are bracing for a, quote, zero allotment year. And with that report in front of the Interstate Stream Commission, state water officials are recommending that farmers not plant crops this year unless they absolutely have to. You may think that's not possible, but yes, you heard that right. And Tom, even a couple years ago, we had a healthy snowpack. The river dried. And it seems things are changing quickly. Are we prepared?
Well, you were talking a little bit about the farmers in the southern part of the state, specifically south of Elephant Butte. And, there are those farmers who rely on, surface water, and then those who have access to well water. And so those who have access to well water obviously will fare better. But, really it's going to be coming like a tiered approach. Like, where are those priorities as far as, is it going to be agriculture? Is it going to be economic development, or somewhere in between? And I've noticed that state engineer John D'Antonio has not been very vocal lately, but it's not his style, I should say, to really kind of start, speaking on what he views as the priorities in these specific areas. And I think that there will come a time, whether it's the governor, the state engineer, or the legislature, where you're going to need to be able to start picking, or identifying anyway, winners and losers in the water battle.
Right.
And that can be done by identifying where those priorities are.
So if we pick up on that, that's a big deal. I mean, you could see it coming where folks say, look, you can plant, you can't. I'm talking about the middle Rio Grande corridor, not statewide now. We're talking right by the river.
That's right. And I think I just want to pick up on one thing. I think it's important to note, Gene, to your statement, and it's true. Farmers are now being told, if you can get away with not planting, don't plant. Let your fields lie fallow. And we tend to think of farms as somewhat monolithic, but there are a number of farms in New Mexico that are not sort of day in, day out, this is how the farmers and their workers support themselves. There are some farms where it's more of an option, let's say, to let the fields lie fallow. And I think that message is especially important to that group, which, to Tom's point, is probably less likely to have access to well water. But we're looking at what are our more water intensive crops? What are our less water intensive crops? We've known for a long time that alfalfa, for instance, is just so water intensive, sort of terrifying to think of giant alfalfa fields running in a year like this. The state is, water is a public resource. As much as we tend to talk about water rights in particular, the legal structure that gives particular farmers access, particular communities access, we have known for a long time that this time was coming. And I think that, unfortunately, as a community, we have not fully addressed what is necessary in order to get through this.
Ed Perea, interestingly, when I look at the activity in the Roundhouse, we got all kinds of bills on solar energy, prescribed fire, statewide greenhouse gas reductions, all kinds of bills. But during the Martinez administration, there was almost no bills dropped because they knew if it got to her desk, it was going nowhere. Have we put ourselves behind the 8 ball here in a significant way because we haven't kept up with this over the past decade?
I think we have. I think there are today thinkers and there are tomorrow thinkers. And I think previous administration were today thinkers. And right now we're trying to look at tomorrow, and we've missed a few years. I think this is a crisis if you follow and you believe the science. There's some very clear empirical data that suggests that we have a problem on our hands, and it's not going to get better without some aggressive steps. And so we are a few steps behind, again, depending on where you stand on this. Some people will look at the Rio Grande with a couple of inches of water, and they'll think that's fine. And, but if you're a farmer, as was mentioned, and we have to rethink how we're using our water. Water is a commodity, and we need to really start to treat it that way. I think maybe some have taken it for granted. You turn on the faucet, hey, it opens up, you get your glass of water. You don't think much more about it, but it's the bigger picture that we need to really think about.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, have you been down to the Farm and Ranch Museum? I think recently. Yeah. Last time I was there, there was an interesting display about how Native Americans use tiny bits of water to, grow lots and lots and lots of crops. It was a really interesting display. And I got to wonder if we're facing a situation where this is an innovation moment, meaning we can really take a hard look about how we use water, how we irrigate, and really get it down to the gram of water, and how we're using it. Is this what we're looking at here? Is this a possibility?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I don't think that you can say that one size fits all. You have to look at all specific options when you're looking at a situation as critical as water.
Right.
It's kind of interesting picking up on what Sophie was saying about alfalfa is that, up in Santa Fe right now, one of the bills that most likely will get passed this session has to do with legalizing marijuana, cannabis.
Yep.
And cannabis and alfalfa actually have the same amount of water use. In fact, they're on that same type of crop rotation. So it should be interesting to see that if all of a sudden cannabis is legalized in New Mexico, the water use, what is that going to do?
That came up during when the hemp was rising. That came up. Everybody said, well, what about the water? And everybody kind of turned their heads. We're out of time this week. Thanks always to our panelists. I'm back in a moment with a few final thoughts. A lot of us have been out and about recently since it's been so unseasonably warm. The heat hasn't been on for a number of days at Casa de Grant. It's barely into February. Count me in with those concerned with what we are seeing with our own eyes right now. It's too warm. It's that simple. Now, when New Mexico officials advise our farmers not to bother planting, as was the double take headline you heard earlier this week, then I would say we have a problem. Climate change is no longer an abstract threat for New Mexico. That's why I was interested in the other headline this week that caught my eye, that General Motors plans to have its entire fleet of vehicles running on electric power by 2035. It's aggressive, without question. Remains to be seen if the other auto manufacturers follow suit, certainly, but it is a significant step. We are in a vulnerable position here in this state because of this area is ground zero for drought, and I've already seen too many stories about so-called climate refugees leaving the area in anticipation of what's coming. A presidential plan is all well and good. We all have to do our part individually as well. Thanks again for joining and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation and viewers like you.